In the frozen winter of 1907, a child walked down a narrow dirt path in Breathitt County, Kentucky. She was 12, barely tall enough to reach the altar rail. Yet the man waiting for her was 30, her own cousin. Locals whispered. The preacher turned pages and the law stayed silent. What followed was not just a marriage but a stolen life, buried in courthouse ledgers and generations of silence. You're watching Hidden Docs, where the shadows of history are pulled into the light. Here we uncover stories that families, churches, and even courts tried to bury, truths too dark for the history books. Today we take you into the Appalachian Mountains, where a child bride's stolen innocence reveals a tradition of silence stretching across centuries. If you want to hear the stories America tried to erase, subscribe to Hidden Docs, because what's buried should never stay hidden. The wind cut sharp through the hollows of Breathitt County, Kentucky, on December 14, 1907. The mountains stood silent, their bare branches clawing against the sky, while a girl barely 12 years old was told by her mother to put on her best dress. Sarah H. Thin, pale, her shoes worn through at the soles, believed she was going to church. She brushed her hair flat with trembling fingers, unaware that this day would not end in hymns, but in a vow she could never choose. The path to the small clapboard house that doubled as a church was muddy, iced at the edges. Neighbors gathered, their breath curling in the cold air. They did not cheer, but neither did they protest. Some clutched their shawls tighter, muttering blessings, while others kept their eyes down, pretending they saw nothing at all. At the front, waiting, stood a man nearly 30, Sarah's cousin by blood. His face was lined with work and years, his hands calloused from farming. To him, this was no crime, no sin. It was tradition. Land would stay in the family. Bloodlines would not be tainted by outsiders. To Sarah, he was not a husband, he was a stranger she feared. The preacher, an old man with wire-rimmed spectacles, opened his Bible. His voice echoed low, monotone, as if reciting words worn down by overuse. "Do you take this child?" He caught himself, correcting quickly. "This young woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" The man said yes. When Sarah's turn came, her voice faltered. Her mother's sharp glance froze the tears in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. A ledger was pulled from a wooden table, its pages filled with neat ink lines, deeds, disputes, and now Sarah's fate. The clerk dipped his pen and wrote her name. To the law of Kentucky, the marriage was questionable. The age of consent stood at 16, but in the mountains law bent beneath custom. The sheriff, when asked later, shrugged. "We don't meddle in family business." Sarah did not remember the final hymn, nor the faces of the neighbors as they drifted away into the cold. She remembered only the sound of the Bible snapping shut, and her small hand swallowed in a man's rough grip. Childhood had ended before it had truly begun. To understand why Sarah H., a 12-year-old child, was given away, one must look deeper into the mountains that shaped her world. Breathitt County, like much of eastern Kentucky in the early 1900s, was a place of rugged isolation. Dirt roads twisted through the hollows, where cabins leaned into the earth and families clung to survival. Poverty was not an exception here. It was the air people breathed. Sarah's parents, James and Martha H., were not cruel in the way outsiders might imagine. They were bound by traditions older than themselves, rules whispered from their parents and grandparents before. In families like theirs, land meant life. A few acres of cornfield, a strip of woodland, a narrow creek where cattle drank, these were treasures. To lose them through inheritance or marriage to an outsider was unthinkable. The solution, as they saw it, lay in blood. Marriage among cousins was not merely tolerated, it was encouraged. Generations of union within kin kept land consolidated, property safe, and loyalties unbroken. Court records from 1880 to 1900 show family names repeating over and over. Sons marrying cousins, daughters wed to uncles. Bloodlines twisting back upon themselves like vines choking their own roots. Sarah's father believed he was securing her future. Her husband-to-be owned 10 acres of adjoining land, enough to ensure Sarah would never be destitute. For James, this was not betrayal, but provision. "She'll be taken care of," he told neighbors who dared to raise a brow. Better in the family than out. But beneath the practical reasoning lay another force, the fear of outsiders. Stories of strangers coming into the mountains, taking women or land, ran deep. To marry beyond blood was to invite risk, shame, or loss. And so children like Sarah were bound not by love, but by geography and tradition. Sarah, of course, knew none of this. Her world was one of creek water, and dolls' heads carved from corn cobs, of schoolbooks with frayed corners and chalk dust on her hands. She did not know that her life had been traded on the weight of land deeds and fear of tainted blood. She only knew that her body and her childhood were no longer her own. Her name became an entry in a ledger, her future mapped by choices she never made. The cabin stood at the edge of a hollow, its roof sagging beneath the weight of winter snow. Smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying with it the smell of damp wood. Inside, a fire crackled, though it did little to warm the dread that knotted in Sarah's stomach. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed, her feet barely touching the floorboards. Her dress still wrinkled from the ceremony. Her new husband moved about the single-room cabin with the casual authority of ownership. He removed his boots, hung his coat, and spoke little. His presence filled the space, heavy and unyielding. Sarah, 12 years old, clutched the quilt around her shoulders. She did not understand what was expected of her, only that something was coming, something she feared but could not name. Neighbors would later say, it was her duty. Some muttered that she was lucky to have land tied to her name. But behind the closed door, luck was a cruel disguise. That night, silence pressed harder than the cold outside. Sarah's husband extinguished the lantern, and the cabin sank into darkness. What followed left no words in her memory, only fragments. His breath in her ear, the rough scrape of his hands, the way the walls seemed to close in. For Sarah, the first night was not the start of marriage, it was the theft of childhood. She was too young to name it as violence, too frightened to speak it as wrong. In her family's eyes, this was simply the role she had been given. But in her body, the pain carved itself into permanence. The morning brought no reprieve. Sarah rose with the dawn, tasked with tending the fire and preparing food, her small hands working clumsily with iron pots. The man at the table ate in silence, his presence a reminder that she belonged to him now in every way. Doctors in Kentucky, writing quietly in medical journals of the early 1900s, noted cases of child wives suffering collapsed pelvises, torn flesh and lifelong injuries from early sexual initiation. Few dared to challenge the practice openly. It was dismissed as rural ways. For Sarah, those reports were not statistics. They were her lived reality. And yet outside the cabin, life went on as though nothing had changed. Neighbors greeted her with polite nods, whispered blessings, and went about their business. In the hollow, silence was not ignorance, it was consent. Sunday morning bells rang faintly through the Appalachian Valley, echoing across snow-dusted ridges. Sarah walked beside her husband, her small frame cloaked in a dress borrowed from her mother. At the church steps, women glanced at her, some with pity, others with approval. No one spoke of her age. No one dared. Inside the wooden chapel, the preacher's voice thundered about obedience, purity, and family. His sermon carried the familiar rhythm of Scripture. Wives submit, husbands lead. For Sarah, every word pressed heavier on her chest. She bowed her head as instructed, but the words carved themselves into a chain she could never break. School was no refuge either. By law, Kentucky required children under 14 to attend classes, but exceptions were made for wives. In 1907, Sarah's name vanished quietly from the school register. The teacher noted she was married off, and the page turned without protest. A child's education traded for silence. Neighbors whispered behind shuttered windows. Some saw her pass by and muttered, "She's keeping the blood." Others simply turned away. In towns like Harlan and Pikeville, newspapers occasionally reported child marriages, but in Sarah's hollow, no article would ever appear. Her suffering was too ordinary, too common to be considered news. Sheriffs and county clerks knew of such unions, yet few intervened. Court records from Bell County, 1908, show marriage licenses issued for girls as young as 12, filed under routine paperwork. Judges signed their names without hesitation, stamping legality onto exploitation. For Sarah, the silence was louder than any voice. Each smile from a neighbor, each nod from the preacher, reminded her that everyone knew and no one cared. Their quiet approval formed a wall higher than any law could climb. The church preached submission. The school erased her. The law endorsed her bondage. Together they created a system where a child's cries vanished before they ever reached the air. When Sarah looked around, she realized something chilling. She had no allies. Not her family, not her neighbors, not the law. Her world was a cage carefully built, brick by brick, by an entire community. By the spring of 1908, Sarah's childhood had collapsed beneath the weight of her swollen belly. She was 13 years old, yet her body carried the burden of a woman. Neighbors remarked that she looked frail as a twig, her dress stretched thin across a frame never meant to bear such weight. Her husband spoke little of her condition, except to boast that the family name would soon pass to the next generation. The midwife came on horseback, riding through the hollow with a worn leather satchel. There were no hospitals nearby, no trained doctors for miles, only women who had delivered dozens of children in cabins like Sarah's. But even the midwife's eyes lingered with worry. She knew that girls this young often bled too heavily, their hips too narrow to deliver safely. Records from rural Kentucky between 1900 and 1910 show maternal mortality rates among teenage brides were nearly double those of grown women. Doctors wrote quietly of unripe bodies, though they rarely raised alarm. These notes never reached newspapers, never stirred reform. They remained buried in medical journals, cold numbers describing warm, terrified girls. Sarah's labor stretched through the night, her screams muffled by the log walls. Her small hands clawed at the quilt, her breath catching in gasps. Hours passed, each contraction wringing the life from her. At dawn, a child was born, tiny, fragile, barely breathing. The midwife wrapped the baby in rags and handed it to Sarah. For a brief moment, she smiled weakly, whispering a name that no record would ever preserve. But within weeks, the baby was gone. Neighbors said the child failed to thrive, a common phrase in a world where infant coffins were carved as often as cradles. Some muttered it was God's will. Others whispered the girl had been too weak to carry life into the world. No one blamed the man who had claimed her, nor the system that had allowed it. The loss hollowed Sarah. She was 13, a widow in spirit, though bound by law and custom to a husband she could not refuse. Her body bore scars that would never fade, her spirit crushed beneath grief too great for her years, and yet life in the hollow moved on. The church bells still rang, neighbors still waved, and the law still looked away. Sarah's tragedy was not an exception. It was the rule. By 1910, Sarah was no longer a girl in the eyes of her community. The census taker came down the narrow dirt path, clipboard in hand, recording the households of rural Kentucky. When he reached Sarah's cabin, he wrote her name neatly in ink, followed by a single word: wife. No age noted, no mention that she had once been a schoolgirl. To the government, to the church, to her neighbors, she was erased. Inside the cabin, her world had shrunk to a cycle of labor. The garden needed tending, the children needed feeding, and her husband demanded obedience. He ruled the house with a heavy hand. When anger flared, his fists did too. In those moments, Sarah learned silence was safer than words. By the time she was 15, she had carried more children. Some lived, others did not. Each birth left her weaker, her body wearing down like the rough boards of the cabin floor. The joy of motherhood was swallowed by exhaustion, her days filled with cries, cooking, and submission. Her laughter, once the bright sound of a girl running barefoot along creek beds, was gone. Her books, her school lessons, her friendships, forgotten relics of another life. Neighbors rarely asked about her well-being. In the hollow, such stories were common. Women nodded knowingly when they saw her, as if her suffering was simply part of their shared fate. A few whispered, "She looks older than her years," but no one spoke of the bruises or the hollowness in her eyes. Historical accounts from Appalachian Kentucky confirm this silence. Court documents filed between 1908 and 1912 contain marriage records for dozens of girls under 14, listed plainly alongside adults. Census entries marked them as wives or housekeepers, never as children. Official paperwork turned exploitation into normalcy, sealing their childhoods in ink as though they had never existed. Sarah became a ghost while still alive, a child transformed into a servant, a mother, a possession. Her dreams dissolved into the daily grind of survival. Her identity swallowed by a system that recognized her only in relation to the man who owned her. The chains were not made of iron, but of silence, tradition, and law. And for Sarah, they held tighter than any lock. By the time Sarah reached her late teens, her eyes had grown older than her years. The lines of hardship etched across her face made her appear closer to 30 than 18. Yet somewhere beneath the exhaustion, A small ember still smoldered, the thought that perhaps there was another life beyond the mountains. Whispers drifted through the hollow like smoke. Tales of girls who had vanished, slipping away on midnight trains bound for Lexington or Cincinnati. Some said they were taken in by relatives in the city. Others murmured darker endings, girls found working in mills or worse, brothels. In oral histories collected from Appalachian Kentucky during the 1920s, old women record the phrase with a kind of resigned awe, taken by the train. For many, it was both escape and exile. Sarah clung to these stories, turning them over in her mind as she rocked her youngest child to sleep. She imagined what it would be like to stand at the station, clutching nothing but a satchel, her name called by the conductor. The thought filled her with both terror and yearning, but reality pressed its weight against her. Poverty shackled her tighter than any lock. She had no money, no family support, and no safe destination. Her husband's watchful presence shadowed her every move. The neighbors, complicit in silence, would never aid her, and the law, already complicit in her bondage, offered no protection if she ran. Rumors circulated of girls who had tried and failed. One, the locals whispered, had been dragged back by her brothers and forced into an even harsher marriage. Another was never seen again, her name fading into silence. For every story of escape, there were two of capture, shame, or disappearance. Sarah weighed the risk with every beat of her heart. To stay meant a slow erasure, her body and spirit drained until nothing remained. To flee meant stepping into the unknown, where survival was uncertain, and punishment almost guaranteed if she failed. She sat many nights by the window, staring toward the faint glow of the railroad miles away, listening for the distant whistle of a passing train. Each echo reminded her of a choice she could not yet make. Decades passed, and Sarah's name faded from the lips of neighbors, from the whispered stories of the hollow. Yet the paper trail remained. In the courthouse basement, where dust coated forgotten ledgers, her marriage license sat between entries of farmers and merchants, as though nothing unusual had occurred. A clerk's neat handwriting read, Sarah H., age 12, married, 1907, no annotation. No alarm, just ink on yellowing paper. The 1910 census confirmed her role, listed as wife with 2 children under her care. By 1920, the record showed more children, her age placed beside her husband's as though they had entered the world as equals. In reality, the documents told a distorted truth, one that erased her childhood and left only the identity society imposed upon her. It was not until the 1960s and 1970s that journalists began digging into the shadows of Appalachian life. Local papers like the Louisville Courier-Journal published investigative pieces on child brides of the mountains, citing cases that mirrored Sarah's with unsettling precision. 12-year-old girls married to cousins, 13-year-olds buried in childbirth, and teenagers recorded in census ledgers as housekeepers instead of students. Social workers who ventured into rural Kentucky and West Virginia during those years wrote reports filled with alarm. They spoke of systemic silence, of traditions that placed property and kinship above the safety of children. Their findings shocked the nation, but for families like Sarah's, it was old news, stories long buried, spoken of only in hushed tones or not at all. Historians piecing together oral testimonies and courthouse records came to a chilling realization. Sarah's life was not an outlier. It was part of a pattern, an inherited system that endured for generations. Her name, hidden in the margins of official documents, echoed the names of countless others. Girls whose stories began and ended the same way, married before their voices had even settled into adulthood. Sarah's suffering was preserved not in memory, but in paperwork. A license here, a census entry there. Her humanity dissolved into statistics, her childhood lost to bureaucratic ink. By the time Sarah grew into her 40s, her face bore the quiet scars of decades lost to submission. Her name rarely appeared outside the confines of census rolls and tax lists. When she died, the obituary, if it existed at all, was a single line in a rural paper, marking her as beloved wife and mother, with no mention that she had once been a child forced into a woman's role. Yet Sarah's absence from memory did not erase her. Her life echoed in the bruises her daughters carried, in the fear her sons learned to normalize, in the silence that stretched across generations. Trauma passed through bloodlines, not always spoken but always present. Families in Appalachia whispered of mothers who had been taken too young, of grandmothers who had never truly been girls. These whispers became folklore, folded into the fabric of mountain life. Historians working through the 20th century uncovered that Sarah's story was only one thread in a vast, shadowy tapestry. Court files revealed child marriages spanning decades, linking families together in webs of kinship and secrecy. Anthropologists described it as a strategy of survival, keeping land property and bloodlines pure. But behind those academic phrases were girls like Sarah, stripped of their voices before they had learned to use them. The legacy of such unions extended beyond genealogy. It carved patterns of silence into entire communities. Children grew up watching their mothers suffer and assumed that was the shape of marriage. Boys learned power came through domination. Girls learned obedience was survival. The cycle fed itself, century after century. Cloaked by poverty, religion, and isolation, Sarah H's story may never be fully written, but its outlines are carved into courthouse ledgers, census entries, and oral histories. She was not alone. She was one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, swallowed by the inbred secret Appalachia kept for centuries. And though her name fades from memory, her shadow remains, a reminder that silence can be as violent as any act, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to whisper back. Sarah H's story is not just one girl's tragedy. It is a mirror held up to the silence of entire communities. What was stolen from her can never be returned, yet her life, buried in ledgers and whispers, forces us to confront what families once normalized. At Hidden Docs, we believe the past should never stay hidden, no matter how dark or unsettling. Subscribe now for more stories history tried to erase.